she was a whisper of a girl, bartered for coin in a den of wolves, when he, a ghost of a man carved from unforgiving granite, cast his long shadow across the sail. The Dust Devil saloon choked on stale whiskey fumes and the rank sweat of desperation, a symphony of crass laughter and the clink of coins against grimy wood. Elara stood on the makeshift stage, a crate barely sturdy enough to hold her slight frame, the glare of a single oil lamp making her pale skin almost translucent. Her dress, a rag of faded calico, hung loose, a testament to lean times and rough hands. Around her, faces leered, avaricious eyes stripping away what little dignity she clung to, their expressions a gallery of primal hunger. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Blackwood with a voice like gravel and greed, extolled her virtues, young, untouched, barely 17 summers. His words slicing into her like whips. Each syllable was a hammer blow against the fragile shield of her composure. She did not cry, tears were a currency she could no longer afford, a luxury stolen long ago. Instead, she fixed her gaze on a crack in the mud-chinked wall, a tiny fissure in the oppressive darkness, and poured all her remaining will into that insignificant fault line, imagining herself shrinking, disappearing into its shadowed embrace. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and cheap tobacco, a suffocating blanket that threatened to smother the last ember of her spirit. She felt the vibrations of stomping boots, the rumble of guttural bids, each one a nail in the coffin of her future. How had it come to this? The question was a bitter echo in the hollows of her memory, a path littered with loss and betrayal, leading inexorably to this crude platform under the lustful gaze of strangers. The wind outside whined a mournful dirge around the ill-fitting door, a soundtrack to her despair. The price was rising, a chilling ascent into oblivion. She closed her eyes, a silent prayer escaping her lips, not for rescue, for she had learned long ago that saviors were phantoms of fireside tales, but for a swift end, a mercy in the heart of brutality. The world had shown her only its teeth, and she braced for the final, tearing bite, her breath held tight in her chest like a trapped bird. The hammer was about to fall, sealing her fate to the highest bidder, a brute with eyes like chips of obsidian and a cruel twist to his lips, when the saloon doors groaned open, scraping against the warped floorboards, a sound that cut through the cacophony like a blade. Into the sudden, uneasy hush stepped Jedediah, a man who moved as if the very air parted for him, a figure forged in the crucible of some unspoken, enduring sorrow. His face, weathered and unreadable as an ancient rock carving, was framed by hair the color of raven's wing, streaked with premature silver at the temples. His eyes, the hue of a winter sky before a storm, swept the room once, cold and dismissive, before settling on Elara. They held no warmth, no pity, only an unnerving stillness that seemed to absorb the saloon's clamor and spit it back as silence. He wore the dust of the trail like a second skin, his duster long and frayed, his gun belt low and purposeful. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His reputation, a chilling whisper through the territories, preceded him like an outrider. Feared, they called him, though no one could name a specific crime, only that he walked alone, spoke little, and trouble seemed to wither in his presence. Silas Blackwood, mid-sentence, faltered, his bravado shrinking under that silent, assessing gaze. "Well now, Jedediah," Blackwood began, his voice suddenly oiled with a false camaraderie, "didn't expect to see you gracing us. Looking for a bit of entertainment?" Jedediah's expression did not flicker. His eyes remained on Elara, not with the predatory glint she had come to expect, but with an intensity that was far more unsettling, as if he were looking through her, into a past she could not fathom. The man with the obsidian eyes, the current high bidder, shifted uncomfortably, his own menace deflating. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, no longer the baying of a pack, but the stillness before a lightning strike. Jedediah's hand, calloused and scarred, rested near the butt of his Colt. He still said nothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into his vest and pulled out a worn leather pouch, tossing it onto the bar. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud, the sound of gold, far outweighing the bids offered. He said, his voice raspy from disuse, a low growl that vibrated through the room. Just one word, yet it carried the weight of an iron decree. Blackwood's eyes darted from Jedediah to the pouch, greed warring with a primal fear. He licked his lips. "Well, now, Jedediah, that's a generous offer. Highest bid, it is," he declared, his forced joviality cracking. He made no move to count it. No one dared question the amount. Jedediah's gaze shifted to Elara again, a silent command. She, trembling not from fear of him, but from the sudden, inexplicable shift in her wretched fate, slowly descended from the crate, her legs unsteady. He did not offer a hand. He simply waited, a bulwark against the tide of faces that now watched with a mixture of awe and resentment. He had bought her, not like a prized mare, nor even a trinket, but like an obligation he was grimly determined to fulfill. He led her out of the Dust Devil Saloon, not by the arm, but by the sheer force of his silent expectation. Elara followed, a shadow in his wake, the jeers and murmurs of the saloon fading behind them like a bad dream. The night air was cold, biting at her exposed skin, but it was clean, a stark contrast to the fetid atmosphere she had just escaped. His horse, a lean, wiry mustang the color of dust, stood tethered patiently. He untied it, swung himself into the saddle with an economy of motion, then looked down at her. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might leave her there, his transaction complete. Instead, he extended a hand, rough, calloused, but surprisingly steady. It was not gentle, not kind, but it was there. Hesitantly, she placed her small, trembling hand in his, and he pulled her up behind him, settling her onto the horse's rump with an impersonal efficiency. There was no room for comfort, only necessity. He said nothing as they rode, the rhythmic clopping of hooves the only sound accompanying the mournful sigh of the wind through the sparse pines. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, bathed in the pale, ethereal light of a crescent moon. Mountains loomed like sleeping giants in the distance, their peaks dusted with an early snow. Elara clung to him, not for warmth, for his back was rigid and unyielding, but simply to keep from falling. She studied the line of his shoulders, the way he sat the horse, a man utterly at one with the wild, desolate land. Where was he taking her? What did he want? The questions swirled in her mind, but she dared not voice them. Silence seemed to be his language, and she was a reluctant student. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a small, isolated cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, a beacon in the immensity of the wilderness. It was a humble dwelling, sturdy and unadorned, built with an eye for survival rather than comfort. He dismounted, then lifted her down, his touch brief and devoid of emotion. He led the horse to a small lean-to, then gestured towards the cabin door. Inside, he grunted, the first word he'd spoken directly to her since his single, declarative. Her Elara hesitated, the threshold a boundary between one unknown and another. But the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of snow, and the alternative was the vast, dark wilderness. She pushed open the rough-hewn door and stepped into the small, firelit interior. It was Spartan but clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire crackling merrily, casting dancing shadows. A rough table and two stools, a narrow cot in one corner, and a ladder leading to a small loft. He followed her in, his presence filling the small space. He pointed to the loft. "Yours." Then he moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. He did not look at her. He offered no explanation, no reassurance. Elara climbed the ladder, her legs aching. The loft was small, barely tall enough to sit up in, with a pile of clean, coarse blankets and a straw-stuffed pallet. It was more than she'd had in months. She lay down, pulling a blanket over her, listening to the sounds below, the crackle of the fire, the occasional rustle as he moved about, the mournful howl of the wind outside. He said nothing more that night. She did not cry. Sleep, when it finally came, was a shallow, uneasy thing, punctuated by the shadows of her past and the unnerving presence of the silent man downstairs. Days bled into weeks, measured by the rhythm of sunrises painting the eastern peaks and the long, cold nights. Jedediah remained a man of few words, his actions the sole currency of their shared existence. He would rise before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the wooden floor her first awareness. He would tend the fire, then head out to chop wood, hunt, or check his trap lines, his movements economical and purposeful. Food appeared on the rough-hewn table, a piece of roasted rabbit, a bowl of thin stew, sometimes even a slightly burnt bannock. He never invited her to eat, but the portion was always enough for two. Ilara, in turn, found her own quiet rhythm. She kept the cabin tidy, swept the floor with a makeshift broom of twigs, and ensured the water bucket was full from the nearby creek. She learned to mend his coarse woolen shirts, her stitches small and neat, a skill her mother had taught her in a life that felt a lifetime ago. He never acknowledged her efforts directly, but once, after she'd patched a particularly large tear in his duster, she saw him run his fingers over the stitches when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression unreadable. Silence was their primary companion, a vast, breathing entity that filled the spaces between them. Yet, it was not always an uncomfortable silence. Sometimes, as the fire crackled in the hearth and a winter storm raged outside, trapping them within the cabin's sturdy walls, the silence felt almost companionable, a shared solitude rather than a lonely one. She watched him, learning his habits, the way he stared into the flames for hours, his face a mask of old grief. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes, the permanent tension in his jaw. Once, she found a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, smoothed by much handling, tucked away on a high shelf. It was a robin, its head cocked as if listening. She left it where it lay, but the image of it, so delicate and so carefully crafted, stayed with her. Who had he carved it for? What story did it hold? His past was a locked room, and she had no key. She, too, held her own stories locked tight, the scars on her back hidden beneath her mended dress, the nightmares kept at bay by sheer force of will. She began to venture outside, gathering firewood closer to the cabin, her fear of the wilderness slowly receding, replaced by a cautious respect. The squirrels chattered at her, and once, a deer watched her from the edge of the woods, its dark eyes curious. She felt a kinship with these wild things, creatures of silence and instinct. One evening, as he was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, his movements precise and familiar, Ilara, emboldened by weeks of unspoken accord, spoke. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. He stilled, his hands pausing in their task. He did not look at her. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. Then, he grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, and resumed his work. It was not a conversation, but it was a beginning, a tiny seed of connection planted in the frozen ground of their isolation. He started leaving out a worn book of poems sometimes, its pages yellowed and soft, its spine cracked. She would read by the firelight, the words painting pictures in her mind, a fleeting escape. How did he know she could read? Perhaps he didn't. Perhaps it was just another inexplicable gesture from this man of stone and shadow. The fragile peace of their isolated existence was shattered by the arrival of the first heavy snows, and with it, a far more menacing storm, Silas Blackwood. He'd been tracking them, his greed and bruised ego a relentless engine. Ilara saw them first, 3 riders emerging from the swirling snow like specters, their forms dark against the blinding white. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. "Jedediah," she breathed, her voice tight with a terror she thought she had buried. He was outside, splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe a familiar sound that now seemed horribly vulnerable. He looked up, his eyes instantly sharp, following her terrified gaze. He saw the riders, and his body tensed, the axe handle gripped tight in his hand. There was no surprise in his expression, only a grim acceptance, as if he had been expecting this confrontation, or one like it, all his life. Inside, Ilara. "Bolt the door," he commanded, his voice low and urgent, devoid of its usual gruffness, now honed to a razor's edge. She didn't hesitate, scrambling back into the cabin, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slid the heavy wooden bolt into place, her hands shaking. Through a small crack in the shutters, she watched as Jedediah stood his ground, a solitary figure against the encroaching threat. Blackwood, flanked by 2 rough-looking men, reined in a few yards from him. The wind howled, whipping snow around them, a fitting backdrop for the unfolding drama. "Well, well, Jedediah," Blackwood sneered, his voice carrying faintly to Ilara. "Thought you could just steal my property and disappear, did you? That girl is mine." Paid for. Jedediah said nothing, his stillness more menacing than any shouted threat. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard," Blackwood continued, his hand drifting towards the pistol on his hip. "Just give her up." Jedediah's response was a slight shift in his stance, his weight settling, ready. "She ain't property," he stated, his voice flat, yet carrying a conviction that resonated even through the thick cabin walls. "And she ain't yours." The air crackled. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Playing the hero, are we?" "Don't suit you, recluse." One of Blackwood's men nudged his horse forward, drawing his gun. "Let's just take her." Before the man could complete his sentence, Jedediah moved. It was not the clumsy aggression of a brawler, but the lethal grace of a predator. The axe, which had seemed a mere tool, became an extension of his arm. He didn't throw it. He took 2 swift strides, and the butt end of the axe handle slammed into the gunman's wrist with a sickening crack. The man screamed, his gun clattering to the snow-covered ground. Simultaneously, Jedediah drew his own Colt, the movement a blur. The second thug, reaching for his weapon, froze as the barrel of Jedediah's pistol leveled at his chest. Blackwood, momentarily stunned by the speed and brutality of Jedediah's response, snarled, "You'll hang for this." Jedediah's eyes, cold as the winter sky, fixed on Blackwood. "Maybe. But you'll be dead inside." Elara pressed her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob. Fear for him, a raw, protective instinct, surged through her, eclipsing her own terror. He was fighting for her. This silent, broken man was risking his life for her. The standoff held for a breathless moment, the only sounds the wind and the whimpering of the injured man. Then, with a sudden, desperate lunge, Blackwood drew his own pistol. A shot rang out, deafening in the snow-muffled air. Elara screamed. Jedediah staggered, a dark stain blossoming on his shoulder, but his own gun fired almost simultaneously. Blackwood cried out, clutching his leg, and toppled from his horse into the snow. The remaining henchman, seeing his employer down and Jedediah still standing, albeit wounded, threw his hands in the air. "I want no more of this." Jedediah, his face pale but resolute, gestured with his gun. "Get him on his horse. And get out." "Don't come back." The man, terrified, hastily helped the groaning Blackwood back onto his horse, retrieved his injured companion, and they retreated, disappearing back into the swirling snow as quickly as they had come. Only then did Jedediah lower his gun, his body swaying. Elara unbolted the door and rushed out, her earlier fear replaced by a desperate urgency. "Jedediah!" He leaned heavily against the woodpile, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his left arm hanging uselessly, blood dripping onto the pristine snow. She reached him, her hands hovering, unsure how to help. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw not coldness, not just sorrow, but a profound weariness, and something else, vulnerability. "Just a scratch," he rasped, but the pallor of his skin betrayed him. "Help me inside." She put her arm around his waist, taking his weight, and slowly, painstakingly, guided him back into the warmth of the cabin, the sanctuary he had built, the sanctuary he had just defended with his own blood. The fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, a defiant beacon against the storm outside and the darkness they had just faced. The fight was over, but another, more intimate battle, against pain and the ghosts of the past, was just beginning. With shaking hands, Elara helped Jedediah to the cot, easing him down. His face was contorted in a silent grimace of pain. The blood was spreading rapidly, soaking through his thick woolen shirt. "The bullet, it's still in?" she asked, her voice trembling but steady. He nodded, his teeth clenched. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were hours, perhaps days, from any help, even if they knew where to seek it. The storm raged outside, a white fury that sealed them in. It was up to her. "Water," she said, more to herself than to him, "and clean cloth." Whiskey. She remembered seeing a bottle tucked away. He watched her, his gaze intense, as she moved with a newfound purpose. She built up the fire, put water on to boil, tore strips from her cleanest spare shift. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid with a fierce determination. This man, who had asked nothing of her, who had saved her from a fate worse than death, needed her now. She would not fail him. She found the whiskey and a wicked-looking hunting knife he kept honed to a razor's edge. "This will hurt," she said softly, uncorking the bottle. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. She poured some of the whiskey onto a cloth and gently began to clean around the wound, her touch surprisingly deft. He flinched but made no sound. Then, taking a deep breath, she held the knife to the fire, sterilizing it in the flames. When it glowed faintly, she took it, her hand steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "Brace yourself," she whispered. He closed his eyes. The next few minutes were a blur of gritted teeth, sharp intakes of breath, and the sickening probing for the bullet. Ilara worked with focused concentration, her earlier life, with its harsh lessons in tending to injuries on the trail, unexpectedly serving her now. Finally, with a small, triumphant cry, she extracted the flattened piece of lead. Jedediah let out a shuddering gasp, his body going slack. She quickly poured whiskey directly into the wound. This time, he did cry out, a raw, guttural sound that tore at her heart. She bandaged him tightly, her movements efficient. Exhausted, she slumped onto the stool beside the cot, watching him. His breathing was shallow, his face ashen. She bathed his forehead with a cool, damp cloth. Hours passed. She kept vigil, tending the fire, checking his bandages, offering him sips of water. The storm continued its relentless assault on the small cabin, the wind shrieking like a banshee. In the flickering firelight, his face seemed younger, the harsh lines softened by pain and vulnerability. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, his eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and a flicker of something unreadable passed through their depths. "Lily," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his gaze unfocused, drifting to a point beyond her. "Forgive me," Ilara's heart clenched. Lily. The name echoed the delicate carving of the wooden robin. His lost child? His wife? She gently took his hand, her fingers cool against his fevered skin. "Rest, Jedediah," she murmured. "You're safe," he mumbled again, something about a fever, about not being strong enough, fast enough. Fragments of a broken past, emerging through the delirium of pain. She held his hand, a silent anchor in his storm-tossed memories. She understood then, not the details, but the profound, aching core of his sorrow, the loss that had carved him into the silent, solitary man he was. It mirrored her own losses, in a way, creating an unspoken bridge between their wounded souls. As dawn approached, the storm began to subside. The wind softened its howl to a mournful sigh. Jedediah's fever broke, and he fell into a deep, healing sleep. Ilara, weary to her bones but filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment, leaned her head against the rough wall beside the cot. She had faced down her own demons to save him, and in doing so, had found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The hearth fire, now a bed of glowing embers, pulsed with a gentle warmth, a promise of life, a testament to the fragile hope that had taken root in the heart of the wilderness, tended by two broken souls who had, against all odds, found a reason to fight, a reason to heal, together. The silence that returned was different now, no longer empty, but filled with the unspoken understanding of shared trauma and nascent trust. The first rays of the rising sun, pale and hesitant, crept through the small window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air, heralding not just a new day, but the possibility of a new beginning, a quiet domesticity forged in fire and blood. The weeks that followed were a slow journey of healing, both for Jedediah's body and for the fractured spaces between them. Ilara tended his wound with a gentle competence, her presence a quiet constant in the small cabin. He watched her, his initial gruffness slowly giving way to a grudging acceptance, then something akin to gratitude, though he rarely voiced it. The silence remained, but it was now a comfortable cloak, woven with threads of shared experience. He began to speak more, not in long narratives, but in brief, almost reluctant offerings. He told her of Lily, his daughter, whose laughter used to fill a cabin much like this one, and of Sarah, his wife, whose smile could melt the winter snows. He spoke of the fever that had swept through their small homestead like a wildfire, claiming them both, leaving him hollowed out, a man adrift in a sea of grief. He didn't speak of blame, but Ilara heard it in the desolate cadence of his voice, the guilt he carried like a shroud. She listened, offering no platitudes, only the solace of her quiet presence, understanding that some wounds could only be eased by being acknowledged, not erased. She, in turn, found herself sharing small pieces of her own story, the betrayals and hardships that had led her to the auction block in the Dust Devil Saloon. Her words were hesitant, fragments of a painful past, but in his quiet attention, she found a safe harbor. He mended things for her, a loose sole on her worn boot, a broken clasp on a small, tarnished locket her mother had given her, his large, scarred hands surprisingly gentle. He carved another bird, a tiny wren, and left it on her pallet in the loft. It was an unspoken apology, a recognition, a gift. Spring arrived, coaxing life from the thawing earth. The creek swelled with meltwater, and the cottonwoods unfurled tender green leaves. Elara planted a small garden behind the cabin, tending the fragile seedlings with a nurturing care. Jedediah watched her sometimes, a faint, almost imperceptible softness in his eyes. The cabin, once a place of stark survival, began to feel like a home. The hearth fire, always central, became a symbol of their shared life, its warmth radiating outwards, chasing away the last vestiges of winter and the lingering shadows of their pasts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of rose and lavender, Jedediah sat beside her on the rough bench outside the cabin. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gently enveloping hers. It was not the impersonal touch of their first ride, nor the urgent grip of shared crisis, but something new, something tender and hesitant. "Elara," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "this place, it could be yours too. If you'll stay." She looked at him, at this man who had been her unlikely savior, her silent protector, her wounded patient, and now, her quiet companion. She saw the lingering sorrow in his eyes, but also a nascent hope, a fragile wish for a future he hadn't dared to imagine. She saw the strength that had endured, the kindness that had been buried but not extinguished. And in his gaze, she saw her own reflection, no longer a victim, but a survivor, a woman finding her own worth, her own voice, in the quiet sanctuary they had built together. "Yes," she whispered, her voice clear and sure. I'll state a small smile, the first she had ever truly seen from him, touched his lips, transforming his weathered face, making him seem years younger. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise passing between them. The future was unwritten, a path stretching out into the vast, beautiful wilderness, but they would walk it together, two souls redeemed by the quiet power of unspoken kindness, finding solace and a new beginning in the heart of the wild. The story of Jedediah and Elara is more than just a tale of the Old West, it's a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the possibility of redemption, even in the harshest of circumstances. It reminds us that even in the deepest silences, understanding can blossom, and that even the most broken spirits can find healing when met with quiet acts of kindness. Their journey from desperate isolation to a shared, hopeful future echoes a truth that resonates across time, that the bravest acts are often not those of loud heroism, but of gentle persistence, of seeing the worth in another when they cannot see it in themselves. We invite you to reflect on the Jedediahs and Elaras in our own world, those who offer sanctuary and those who find the courage to accept it. Their quiet strength, their resilience, and their capacity for love in the face of adversity are qualities that build not just homes, but communities. If their story has touched your heart, consider subscribing to our channel. Join us as we continue to explore tales of courage, connection, and the enduring human spirit, narratives that remind us of the profound impact we can have on one another, one small, unspoken act of kindness at a time. Let's keep these stories alive, together.